kind of sweeping broad, and frankly, the chaos around the tariffs is actually very bad for American manufacturing. I talked about the way some of these very broad tariffs actually increase costs for the machines companies need to manufacture in the United States. That's something that like all the companies acknowledge. Same thing happens for like car manufacturer. If you import a part from Europe and you have to pay a tariff on the part, actually makes it more expensive to manufacture that final car here in the US. So the companies are really beginning to get concerned about the way the breadth and chaotic nature are undermining U.S. manufacturing. And, I think are hopeful that some of those concerns will feed into deals. We'll see if that in fact materializes.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Peter Harrell from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Peter was a Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the National Security Council and the National Economic Council from 2021 to 2022. Peter, thank you very much for joining us today on the Trump Report.
It's great to be on.
Peter, in your recent article in Foreign Affairs, you say there's a route to a more prosperous and secure United States through Trump's tariff policies. How far away is the US administration from that right now?
Yeah, well, look, I think what we have in fact seen out of the Trump administration over the last 6 or 8 weeks has been a frankly pretty chaotic and aggressive set of trade policies that I think, so far we've obviously seen major impacts on markets. We've seen major impacts on American allies. We've also seen Trump himself have to pull back some of the tariffs that he's introduced. I think there have been a number of us over 6-12 months now who have argued that there is a way the United States could effectively use tariffs, often in concert with allies and partners, in order to advance our strategic competition with China and in order to rebuild American manufacturing. I think what we have seen is some effort by the Trump administration to do that, but we are also seeing, frankly, a very chaotic and probably excessively aggressive approach that I actually fear is going to not only alienate a bunch of allies, but also undermine some of the Trump administration's very own manufacturing goals. So pretty far away, frankly.
And I want to come on to the sort of change in the tech and microchip import tariffs that Trump has announced. There was some confusion over what level of tariffs smartphones and computers fall under alongside the microchips. Where exactly are we on what Trump's approach to tariffing this tech is?
Well, so this kind of brings me to the point I was just making, or illustrates the point I was just making about the chaos we've seen out of the Trump administration. So, the U.S. does not manufacture today that many microelectronics, laptops, cell phones, that kind of things. We do manufacture some semiconductors, the raw chips that go into those devices, though the American share of production has been falling for a couple of decades. And over the last couple of years, you've seen a bipartisan effort to help rebuild American semiconductor manufacturing. So I think there's actually quite a bit of support in the U.S. for Trump's goal of rebuilding both electronics manufacturing and semiconductor manufacturing. But this kind of illustrates the challenges with the chaotic approach that Trump has taken, because what we saw him do, first of all, was move American tariffs to China, where a lot of these things are currently made. From on electronics, almost no tariffs when he was sworn in less than 3 months ago, to as of the end of last week, 145% tariffs. Now, if you're a phone manufacturer, computer manufacturer, 145% tariff, that's definitely get you to build things in the United States, or at least not in China. The problem you have is you can't move that production, in 48 hours. It might take you a year. It might take you 2 years to do that. And so in the short term, what you'd have to do is double the price of your phone or computer for American consumers. And I think there's at least somebody in the Trump administration kind of realized that after they announced these very, very high tariffs, realized that doubling in the short-term costs of phones and computers and things was going to be very politically unpopular here in the United States. And so you saw them pull back that tariff and instead announce that for phones and semiconductors and electronics, what they want to do is bring in another set of tariffs over a longer time horizon that presumably will give manufacturers some time to adjust those supply chains so they can actually produce those things either here in the US or at least not in China. Before they actually have to start paying all these tariffs to mitigate the price impacts. But there's another piece of this that's really important and that kind of illustrates why untargeted tariffs can harm Trump's own goals. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's a lot of interest here in the U.S. in rebuilding semiconductor manufacturing. And there's been bills in the U.S., laws in the U.S. to help make investments in American semiconductor manufacturing. One of the most expensive parts of manufacturing semiconductors is the machines that you need to buy in order to manufacture those semiconductors. A lot of these are built by a Dutch company named ASML. They're built in Europe. Some of those machines can cost $100 million a piece. Other of these machines are made in Japan by companies like Tokyo Electrons. Those can cost tens of millions of dollars a piece. When Trump announced these sweeping global tariffs, not just the China tariffs, these sweeping global tariffs of 10% or more on almost all US imports, he's actually increased the cost of those machines by 10 or 20% or more, which actually drives up the cost of manufacturing semiconductors here in the United States. All of a sudden, those machines to make them cost a lot more. So I think you also see the administration kind of grappling with the fact that some of their tariffs may actually directly undermine their U.S. manufacturing goals. They're trying to figure out potentially a somewhat more targeted approach to these trade wars.
And that targeted approach, specifically on semiconductors, does that appear to be more about maintaining those supplies from China, or is there going to be more of a strategy in the next coming days, weeks, that is more about targeting the Chinese semiconductor industry?
So what they have said publicly is that they are expecting to bring in a separate regime, tariff regime, separate from these kind of China tariffs, separate from the quote unquote reciprocal tariffs that they've announced for countries like the United Kingdom, for jurisdictions like the European Union, that will focus on semiconductors, on microelectronics, on consumer electronics. That's what we started hearing Secretary Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, say, and that Trump confirmed yesterday. What it appears they're going to do is use a statute called Section 232, which is a kind of separate tariff authority from most of what we've seen them do over the last 6 or 8 weeks. It is a much more deliberative tariff authority. It requires the Commerce Department to kind of make a detailed months-long investigation into, what are the challenges to manufacturing of these goods here in the United States, and to set up a somewhat more nuanced potentially tariff regime that will encourage some of that onshoring. So I think, they've said they're going to get this process for these tariffs underway within a month or two. That will then take a couple of months to play out. So I think they are setting the stage for something that will involve some tariffs in a way that encourages onshoring of this production, but it does so in a much more deliberative way. But I will say that is what they seem to be saying over the last 48 hours. I also think we all have to recognize it has been a fairly chaotic approach to trade to date, and while they seem to be trying to pivot to a less chaotic approach, they actually are going to have to deliver on that, and we'll see what they in fact do.
And what sort of response could we gauge from China on this, especially on semiconductors? I mean, obviously, Taiwan is a pretty significant player in the trade on semiconductors and the creation and the creation of them. Could China take further action against Taiwan as a result of this? I mean, whether that be trade embargoes or even military action, or, as you say, is this actually more focused on the US's relationship with allies in Europe?
Yeah, so let me break that question down into a couple of parts. First, we have definitely over the last 10 days see China substantially expand its retaliation against Trump's trade war. Prior to Trump's April 2nd announcement of quote unquote reciprocal tariffs, he'd already imposed tariffs of about 20% on Chinese products. We'd actually seen China take a pretty measured response to those tariffs. It had imposed some counter tariffs, some of sort of tariffs of its own, as well as some other measures like targeting a couple of U.S. defense firms that frankly did very little business in China. So there's sort of more of a symbolic measure. But kind of prior to April 2nd, the approach we saw out of China was one that I read as China signaling, yes, it felt it needed to respond, but it wanted to limit its retaliation because it was trying to keep the door open to a deal. What we have seen in the last 10 or 12 days is China sort of quantitatively and qualitatively expand its retaliation. It has imposed quite sweeping tariffs on basically all American exports to China. It has begun to cut off exports of critical minerals, sort of minerals you need for manufacturing all around the world, but including very much in the United States. It's cutting a bunch of these exports off to the United States, and it's expanding its list of companies that it's retaliating against. So really a sea change in the way China is retaliating, I think, because they have decided, oh, if Trump is serious about forcing tariffs will force decoupling on us. If we want a deal, we actually have to put a lot of pressure on Trump in returns. We're definitely seeing China retaliate with quite a bit of economic pressure. I still with a goal of getting to a deal, but kind of deciding rather than making nice to get to a deal, they're taking I'm going to punch you back in the face, and then you're going to have to make a deal with me approach, and we'll see how that works. I think there is more and more concern. When I talk to, I'm an economics person. When I talk to my friends in the security community, there is more and more concern that we could see aggressive Chinese action against Taiwan. Probably not an outright invasion, but that you could see something like an embargo on Taiwan, something that they likely have the capability to do if they think that doing so this is an opportune time because the situation with the U.S. has deteriorated and so forth. So I do think this kind of, chance for escalation from a trade war into something more than just a trade war, maybe not a hot war, but some kind of, hybrid conflict is something we all need to be watching.
And away from the security concerns, how much does the US have to be concerned about third parties in this, such as Southeast Asia that took a particularly hard hit, but could also be offshore. It could also be taking on a lot of offshore production from China, or, allies in Europe. I mean, for example, today the British government suspended a slew of their own tariffs. How aware does Trump have to be that other nations could take on Chinese trade, could be helping China to avoid tariffs? Does he have a strategy for that yet?
Yeah, I think we are seeing that get under development out of his administration. Look, it's very clear. You just look at the history of American tariffs on China, going back to Trump's first term, and there are ways in which American tariffs on China can both benefit and harm other third countries, so whether in Europe or in Asia. So when we saw Trump's first term trade war, increasing tariffs on China, but frankly not doing that much to tariff the rest of the world, we actually saw some Southeast Asian countries become big winners from that trade war because, producers of things like phones and computers and things like furniture and clothing moved production for the American market that was in China to places like Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia. So we saw clear kind of winners coming out of that. I think you also saw some losers. For example, as Chinese car manufacturers could no longer send cars to the American market because of American tariffs, one thing they did was sold more cars in Europe, right? And that begins to hurt, car manufacturers in Germany and France and elsewhere. And then you saw European countries decide they had to raise some barriers last year. They had to raise some barriers of their own to Chinese cars because they were facing this displacement of trade driven by Trump's tariffs. What we've seen now is kind of very, very high tariffs on China, high tariffs on much of the rest of the world, but also some willingness to have deals with much of the rest of the world, where, as you say, U.S. Trump administration is encouraging foreign governments to lower their barriers to the United States. And they are also talking about working with foreign governments to encourage cooperation on China as a part of these deals. For example, conceptually, you could imagine that would include joint tariffs on Chinese products. Let's protect all of our car market collectively from these Chinese cars. Though what the Trump administration means specifically when they talk about joint action on China as part of these deals, they've not yet given a lot of kind of color or detail to what they're looking for on that.
And how fast does the US have to act now to get trade deals done if they do want them? And is it possible in this kind of short time span they've got now to do that without ending up with a lot of more cosmetic agreements instead of that wider rebalance that Trump says he really wants?
Well, this is, I mean, the U.S. imports about $3 trillion of goods every year. So I guess this is a $3 trillion question. If you think about it, that way. Look, traditionally, American trade agreements have taken quite some time to negotiate. If I look at Trump's term one U.S. Mexico Canada deal, his renegotiation of NAFTA, it took about 2 years to negotiate. Trump administration has now said it's trying to conclude, maybe 70 agreements in 90 days. That seems, frankly, very challenging based on experience. Now, they have kind of two options on how they can proceed here. One is to try to push back that 90-day deadline. I won't be surprised if negotiations with some of these countries are going well, if we see some pushing back of that 90-day deadline. The other thing is to take deals that, make a lot of commitments, but the proof is going to be on the implementation and how they on how they actually come together. You could sort of take a deal where, a government, whether it's a UK government, it's a Japanese government, whether it's a, Vietnamese government, kind of says, yes, I'll make these, I'll make all these barriers to your companies go away. I promise. And, sort of see how that actually plays out in practice going future. These aren't mutually exclusive, right? You could push back the deadline a little bit and try to firm up your deal a little bit more. So it's not just kind of paper concessions, but they are definitely going to have something, either push back that deadline or make deals that will be much more what you might call, kind of promissory notes or promissory deals rather than actual substantive deals. We'll see which of these options they choose, or if they choose some combination of them both.
And Peter, just finally, as I know that you haven't got much time left, you mentioned before the losers in a trade war, specifically electric cars, and how more were shipped into Europe. I'm thinking now about how you see a lot more Chinese electric cars in Europe than you do Teslas, for example. We know that Elon Musk wasn't particularly happy with the tariff regime. How much internal resistance could Trump face from these tariffs from large American manufacturers?
Well, yes, I mean it was interesting, when to see when as Trump was hiking tariffs and touting his tariffs, Elon Musk, who works for him these days, posting kind of Milton Friedman, the famous economist, free trade memes on the internet. So yes, we've definitely seen some disagreement from industrial leaders here in the U.S. on these tariffs. Look, I think we are seeing quite a bit of pushback from American businesses on a number of these tariffs. Now, American businesses are frankly concerned by crossing the president. They don't want him to come after them. And so I think you've seen a lot of this pushback happen kind of behind closed doors, as CEOs calling cabinet secretaries with companies trying to get their trade associations to weigh in rather than sort of publicly criticizing the tariffs. I do think you are seeing some of this private and kind of via third party criticism emerging. And I think that is because American manufacturers understand that these kind of very broad, whereas some, targeted and more specific tariffs might actually help the manufacturer in the U.S. It's kind of sweeping, broad, and frankly, the chaos around the tariffs is actually very bad for American manufacturing. I talked about the way some of these very broad tariffs actually increase costs for the machines companies need to manufacture in the United States. That's something that all the companies acknowledge. Same thing happens for car manufacturer. If you import a part from Europe and you have to pay a tariff on the part, actually makes it more expensive to manufacture that final car here in the U.S. So the companies are really beginning to get concerned about the way the breadth and chaotic nature are undermining U.S. manufacturing. And, I think are hopeful that some of those concerns will feed into deals. We'll see if that in fact materializes.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.